The Civil War was fought with cannons and rifles, but it was also fought in boarding houses, in parlors, and whispered conversations. In 1864, one storm off the North Carolina coast pulled those worlds together when a blockade runner tried to slip past the Union blockade near Fort Fisher. A woman in black carried a satchel she refused to surrender, even as the ship pitched in the dark. Whatever was inside, she believed it was worth protecting at all cost. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is episode 185, Spies of the Civil War, Rose Greenhow. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of North Carolina can look deceptively calm in the daylight. On clear mornings, the water stretches out in a soft blue haze, broken only by the white line of surf where waves meet sand. But on the night of October 1st, 1864, there was nothing calm about it. Wind tore across the water, driving waves toward the shore. The blockade runner Condor fought its way through the dark, its hull shuddering as each wave slammed against it. The ship had slipped out of Europe under secrecy, carrying passengers, diplomatic papers, and gold meant for the Confederate government. The captain knew the risk. Union ships patrolled the coastline, and storms could turn deadly in a matter of hours. But the Confederacy was desperate. Every shipment that made it through the blockade meant food, weapons, and money. As the coastline near Fort Fisher came into view, the storm grew worse. Rain slashed against the deck as the captain tried to steer toward the safety of the fort. But the waves pushed the ship off course. With a sudden, violent jolt, the Condor struck a sandbar and lurched to a stop. Passengers grabbed for railings, and officers shouted orders for the lifeboats to be lowered into the water. Among the passengers was a woman dressed in black. She clutched a leather satchel and refused to let go of it. Before stepping into the lifeboat, she tied the satchel securely around her waist. Crew members helped her climb down into the small boat with other passengers as it swung on its ropes beside the Condor. When the lifeboat was lowered toward the water, a wave slammed against its side. The sudden jolt threw several passengers off balance. The woman, dressed in black, lost her footing, slipped over the edge, and fell into the water below. The satchel, heavy with gold, dragged her beneath the surface. Some nearby heard a cry, but in the chaos of the storm, they weren't able to help. By morning, the sea had calmed. On the beach near Fort Fisher, locals found a woman's body washed ashore. A leather satchel was tied around her waist, and gold was still inside. Her name was Rose O'Neal Greenhow. For years, she had been one of the most effective spies of the Confederacy. The American Civil War is often remembered through the battles that shaped it: Bull Run, Antietam, Shiloh, and Gettysburg. Those battles are etched into monuments and printed in textbooks. But behind the armies and the generals, another war unfolded. It was a war of secrets. Espionage during the Civil War didn't resemble the organized intelligence agencies of later conflicts. There were no formal schools for spies, no standardized training. Instead, networks formed through friendships, family ties, political loyalties, and often by chance. Information moved in whispered conversations and in coded messages sewn into clothing or hidden in false bottoms of trunks. It moved in the hands of people who did not wear uniforms: shopkeepers, telegraph operators, boarding house owners, and very often, women. Women were underestimated. Many men believed they were too emotional and too fragile to be dangerous. That assumption created opportunity. Women could sit in parlors while officers talked freely. They could move through towns without attracting the same suspicion as military men. They could carry messages in baskets, in sewing kits, even in the hems of their dresses. Some acted out of conviction, while others were drawn into spying out of a complicated mix of loyalty, grief, and opportunity. Their work rarely appeared in early, simplified versions of Civil War history, but their stories reveal a hidden layer of the conflict, a layer where a single letter could change the outcome of a battle, and one conversation could cost a life. Among these figures, Rose O'Neal Greenhow stood out. Her intelligence network reached into the highest levels of Washington society. Her information influenced the first major battle of the war. Her name appeared in newspapers across the country, and her life ended in the surf of the Carolina coast, still tied to the gold she carried. Before Rose met her end on that shoreline, she moved with others through a complicated and dangerous world of Civil War espionage. In Virginia, a teenager named Belle lived in the town of Martinsburg. When Union troops occupied the area, tensions ran high. One day, a Union soldier insulted Belle's mother. Belle responded by shooting him. The incident made her a local symbol of defiance and drew the attention of Confederate officers. Belle began passing information to the Confederacy. She listened to Union soldiers, flirted, asked questions, and carried messages. She rode through enemy lines, sometimes under fire. Her story was sensationalized. Newspapers called her the Cleopatra of the Secession. But beneath the exaggeration was a young woman who had chosen a dangerous path and refused to step back from it. In Richmond, Elizabeth Van Lew lived a very different life. Born into a wealthy family, she had been educated in Philadelphia and held strong anti-slavery beliefs. When Virginia seceded, Elizabeth stayed in Richmond. She built a spy network that reached deep into Confederate society. She visited Libby Prison, bringing food and supplies to Union prisoners. Some of those visits were cover. She helped men escape. She sent coded messages to Union officers. To protect herself, Elizabeth cultivated a public image as an eccentric woman. Neighbors called her Crazy Bets. They saw her as odd and harmless. That misjudgment allowed her to continue her work. Men had created the shadow world women were drawn to during the war. Timothy Webster, a Pinkerton detective, infiltrated Confederate circles early in the conflict. He traveled under false identities, met with Confederate officers, and sent detailed reports to Allan Pinkerton, who headed the Union's intelligence efforts. Webster's work was so effective that Pinkerton later described him as one of his best agents. Eventually, Webster was betrayed by a double agent, arrested, and executed. In Tennessee, a young man named Sam Davis carried intelligence for the Confederacy. He traveled alone, often on foot, through dangerous territory. In 1863, he was captured with documents hidden in his boot. Union officers offered to spare his life if he revealed the source of the information. He refused and was executed at the age of 21. The spies of the Civil War were often ordinary people stepping into extraordinary danger, with little protection and no guarantee of recognition. Rose Greenhow accepted the dangers when she stepped into this world. Rose was born in 1813 on a plantation in Maryland. Her early life was marked by loss. Her father was murdered when she was still a child. Her mother struggled to support the children, and eventually, Rose and one of her sisters were sent to live with an aunt in Washington, D.C. Washington, in the early 19th century, was not yet the grand capital it would later become, but the city was filled with political energy. Senators, congressmen, diplomats, and military officers filled its boarding houses and parlors. Rose grew up in this environment. She watched how people behaved in rooms where power was negotiated. She learned how to listen more than she spoke. She understood that charm could open doors that might otherwise remain closed. As a young woman, she became known for her intelligence and wit. She moved easily in social circles that included some of the most influential men in the country. She formed friendships with politicians and diplomats. One of her close friends was James Buchanan, who would later become President of the United States. Rose married Dr. Robert Greenhow, a scholar and diplomat who worked for the State Department. The marriage brought her into even higher social circles. She attended dinners where foreign policy was discussed, and she watched political rivalries play out in the midst of polite conversations. Rose and Robert had 4 daughters. When Robert died in an accident, Rose was left a widow with children to support. She did not have independent wealth, but she did have connections and an impressive ability to navigate Washington society. Rose opened her home as a gathering place for politicians and military officers. She listened as they talked about legislation, appointments, and increasingly, the growing divide between North and South. Rose's loyalties were clear. She identified with the South. Her family roots, her social circle, and her beliefs aligned with the Southern cause. When Southern states began to secede, Washington changed. Old friendships strained as suspicion settled across the city. Rose remained in the capital, but her sympathies were no secret. In the spring of 1861, as the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter and the war officially began, Confederate sympathizers approached Rose about gathering intelligence. She never hesitated. Rose's home on 16th Street became the center of a spy network. She worked with other Southern sympathizers in Washington, including women who could move through social spaces unnoticed, and men who could travel more freely. Together, they built a system of collecting and transmitting information. Rose used coded letters written in cipher. She relied on couriers who could carry messages out of the city. Many of her couriers were young women whose presence attracted little suspicion. Others were laborers, people who moved through the city without being closely watched by those in power. She also used the most powerful tool she had: conversation. Officers and politicians continued to visit her home. Rose welcomed them in, listened, and asked questions that seemed harmless. She expressed concern for the safety of soldiers and sympathized with the burdens of command. She played the role expected of her: a grieving widow, a charming hostess, an innocent woman with no power. Rose would later describe how easily powerful men dismissed her presence. "They spoke before me," she wrote, "as though I were but a piece of furniture in the room, forgetting that a woman may listen as well as look." She used that underestimation to her advantage. Information about troop movements, political disagreements, military frustrations easily flowed in conversations in Rose's home, and she gathered it quietly, storing information and details that would later be sent south. One of the most significant moments in her espionage work came in July 1861. Union forces were preparing to move against Confederate troops near Manassas, Virginia. Rose obtained details about the timing and strength of the Union advance. She sent this information to Confederate General Beauregard. The message reached him in time. On July 21st, Union and Confederate forces clashed in what became known as the First Battle of Bull Run. The battle ended in a Confederate victory. It shocked many in the North who had expected a quick and decisive Union win. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, later credited Rose's intelligence with helping secure that victory. Her success did not go unnoticed in Washington. Allan Pinkerton, who headed the Union's intelligence efforts, began to focus on Rose. Pinkerton had built a reputation as a skilled investigator before the war. Now he turned those skills toward uncovering Confederate spies in the capital. He placed agents near Rose's home. They intercepted letters and watched who came and went. Rose sensed the surveillance. "I knew I was watched," she later wrote, "but I would not cower before those who sought to make me afraid. They might imprison my body, but my spirit they could not subdue." When Union officers finally entered her home in August 1861, Rose described the moment with a mixture of indignation and resolve. Soldiers searched her belongings, rifled through drawers, and seized letters she had hidden away. She stood in the center of the room, refusing to sit and show fear. Rose Greenhow was arrested and confined to her home under guard. Soldiers surrounded the property, and visitors were monitored. But confinement couldn't stop Rose. She continued to communicate with Confederate contacts, using whatever means she could find. Notes were smuggled out through sympathetic neighbors and hidden in small objects. Eventually, the Union decided the house arrest wasn't enough. Rose was transferred to the old Capitol Prison, a former boarding house turned into a detention center for political prisoners, captured Confederate officers, and spies. Rose shared a cell with her youngest daughter, Little Rose. The presence of a child in a prison drew public attention and sympathy. Old Capitol Prison was cold, overcrowded, and filled with the sounds of boots on stone floors and keys turning in iron locks. Rose wrote about the loneliness of those nights, the uncertainty, and the weight of confinement. But she also wrote about the small acts of humanity that helped her endure. "In that dreary place," she wrote, "I resolved to meet my fate with the dignity of a woman who knows her duty and fears not to perform it." She described guards who softened when they saw her daughter, and other women who whispered encouragement through the bars. She wrote about sewing to pass time, about the ache of separation from her older children, and the belief that she was suffering for a cause she considered righteous. Rose continued to write letters from prison, criticizing the Union government and defending the Southern cause. Some of those letters were smuggled out and published in newspapers across the South, where she was celebrated as a symbol of resistance. She also continued to gather information. Prisons are places where stories circulate. Guards talk a lot, and so do prisoners. Rose listened and passed along what she could. Her captors grew frustrated. She was difficult to silence and difficult to control. Eventually, Union authorities decided rather than keeping Rose imprisoned indefinitely, they would send her away. In 1862, Rose and her daughter were placed on a ship and sent south, exchanged across the lines, and delivered into Confederate territory. In Richmond, Rose arrived not as a prisoner, but as a hero. Crowds gathered to see her. Newspapers praised her courage and her sacrifices. Jefferson Davis welcomed her and recognized the value of her work. In a war where morale was critical, Rose's story carried weight, and the Confederate government decided to use her in a new way. Rose was sent to Europe as an unofficial diplomat and advocate for the Southern cause. The Confederacy hoped to gain recognition and support from Britain and France. Official envoys worked through formal channels, but Rose worked through social ones. In England and France, Rose attended dinners, receptions, and private meetings. She spoke with aristocrats, politicians, and influential families. She described the South's cause in terms she believed would resonate: self-determination, resistance to centralized power, and economic independence. She also wrote and published a memoir while living in London. She defended the Confederacy and criticized the Union as she presented her version of events and framed the South as a nation fighting for its rights. Her charm and intelligence made her a compelling figure in European society. Many were drawn to the story of this woman who had been imprisoned for her beliefs and had risked her life for her cause. But the war continued to turn against the Confederacy. Union victories, the Emancipation Proclamation, and shifting political calculations made European recognition less likely. By 1864, the Confederacy was under increasing strain. Supplies were scarce, cities were under constant threat, and the blockade tightened. Rose prepared to return home. She boarded the blockade runner Condor in Scotland. With her, she carried diplomatic dispatches and a significant amount of gold intended for the Confederate government. The gold represented more than money to Rose, who believed it represented hope that Europe would someday fund the Confederacy's armies and sustain its fight. The voyage across the Atlantic was dangerous. Union ships patrolled the waters, and storms were common. But blockade runners were built for speed and stealth. As the Condor approached the North Carolina coast, the weather turned. The storm that would claim the ship gathered strength. When the vessel struck the sandbar near Fort Fisher, chaos followed. Passengers and crew scrambled to save themselves. In that chaos, Rose made the choice to tie her satchel around her waist. Whether she feared the gold would be stolen if she left it out of her sight, or was protecting sensitive documents that could not be allowed to fall into Union hands, there's no way to know exactly what she was thinking in those final moments. What is known is that the weight of the satchel pulled her underwater. Her body was found the next morning on the beach, with the satchel still tied to her. Confederate soldiers and locals buried Rose in Wilmington, North Carolina. For those who supported the Confederacy, her death was seen as a final act of devotion. A woman who had given her life, her freedom, and her last breath to the cause she believed in. Rose O'Neal Greenhow remains a complicated figure. Her intelligence work influenced the early months of the Civil War. Her information helped shape the outcome of the First Battle of Bull Run. Her letters and diaries, some preserved and published, offer rare insight into the world of espionage. She was celebrated in the South as a patriot and condemned in the North as a traitor. To many, she was something more difficult to categorize, a woman who stepped into a role few expected her to play and refused to step back from it, even when she knew her life was at risk. "If my life is required for the cause," she wrote, "I'm ready to give it." Rose's story shows how much of the conflict took place away from the battlefields, in the hands of people whose names rarely appeared in official reports. The war was fought with rifles and cannons, but it was also fought with information, with letters and conversations, choices made in the shadows of private rooms. Rose's life ended on a dark shoreline, the weight of gold and paper literally dragging her down. The Confederacy she served would fall within months. The cause she believed in would be defeated. But the hidden war she took part in the war of spies and secrets, left its mark. It changed how future conflicts would be fought. It showed that those dismissed as powerless can sometimes shape events in ways that are hard to see until time has passed. Rose O'Neal Greenhow lived in a space between influence and danger. Her story is not simple. It's not tidy, but it's human, full of conviction and contradiction. And in the end, she died as she had lived for much of the war, holding tightly to the cause she chose, even as the tide pulled her under. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. You'll find sources for this episode in the show notes where you're listening or at southernmysteries.com. If you'd like to support this independent podcast and hear more stories, consider becoming a patron of Southern Mysteries. Members get access to exclusive content, including the full archive of the first 3 seasons of Southern Mysteries, and those who support at the much obliged level, there are monthly episodes of my patron-exclusive podcast, Audacious. That show dives into some of the most scandalous true crime stories in American history. You can learn more and start listening today at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries, or if you have the Patreon app, just open it up and search for Southern Mysteries Podcast. Thanks for that. And as always, thanks for listening to Southern Mysteries.